I am Margarida Silva. I'm a researcher at the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations. SOMO, it is a Dutch-based organization that does what it says on the tin. We investigate multinationals. With our work, we have identified several of the problems or challenges that Europeans are facing right now, many of which Renee and also Max have already talked about, so we don't need to go over them in too much detail. But maybe just to say very, very briefly that, of course, Europeans are basically facing overlapping crises at the same time. With COVID, climate change, and war, these have, of course, created immense human suffering and loss, but they've also sent shockwaves through the globalized market system. A cost of living crisis has followed, with energy and food prices skyrocketing. And in the background, we have a broken digital public sphere, which has enabled the spread of disinformation, but has also diverted funding away from quality journalism. What we have found is that with this crisis, we always find one common denominator that is either driving or worsening them, and that's corporate power, extreme corporate power especially. Globally and at EU level, we see higher levels of concentration, where just a handful of companies are wielding extreme amounts of power, both economically and politically. With this panel, we want to explore the concrete impacts that this power has on people. From food insecurity to lower salaries to strained public health systems, we really want to go from abstract to concrete. And I am joined by a really amazing panel of speakers, including Anastasia Nesvatelova, and if I do get someone's name wrong, I'm very, very sorry. But Anastasia is the director in macroeconomics and development policies at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We have also Oliver Rothig, who is Regional Secretary at Europa, which is the European Service Workers Union. We have Nick Dearden, Director of Campaigning Organizations Global Justice Now, and author of Pharmanomics, How Big Pharma Destroys Global Health, but also wealth, I would imagine. And finally, we have Ioannis Lianos, Professor of Global Competition Law and Public Policy at the University College of London, founder of Inclusive Competition Forum, and a former head of Hellenic Competition Commission. I have to say that for each one of these speakers, we could probably have gone on with the credits, but we don't have that much time. So yeah, we will try to go through these topics, and at the end, if we have time, we will open it up for the audience so that we can have a little bit of an interaction. But starting maybe with Anastasia. Is it okay if I stand here? Yeah, of course. So of course, in the past few years, we've seen that the global system has been hit by several shocks. This have disturbed, of course, food production globally. But as the UNCTAD has put it in its recent report, the crisis also presented an opportunity for a set of fairly unknown corporations, that's food commodity traders. So I would like you to explain it to us right now, who these companies are and how they impacted food prices and availability.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. What I'm going to talk about is part of our flagship Trade and Development Report, is the major economic publication of the United Nations on the global economy. So that puts my scope here a little bit more away from Europe and into the global impact of corporate power concentration, profiteering, and also hopefully if I were to ask you to take something away from my talk, is maybe to start thinking differently about markets themselves and corporations and businesses as a node of power, because what I'm going to show you requires you to go beyond very conventional approaches to market regulation or even understanding concentration or market limits, and go, if you want, kind of bottom upwards. We started looking at food commodity traders. They are, as Margarita said, it works. It's not that they're not necessarily unknown, it's just that nobody is looking at them closely. We do all know them. In fact, they have a very nice acronym uniting the big four companies between themselves. They're called the ABCD companies. The letters stand for the capital letter of every company's name. So there are 4 of them dominating the world market. Conservatively, they account for 70% of the global food systems. Some estimates put it up to 90%, but in truth, we don't actually know because nobody is looking to regulate them and to solicit information and data that they would have been obliged to disclose if they were publicly held corporations. They're not. Only 8 companies in our sample of 15 are required to do that. The rest are private businesses and they do whatever they want to do. They have no public obligation to disclose their subsidiary behavior or financial reporting. The reason we wanted to look at them last year in detail is the parallels between profit patterns between the energy sector in the wake of pandemic and the war in Ukraine and profits in the food trading area. And you can see that at least the dynamic, if not the exact, the absolute numbers, but the dynamic of escalation are very similar. And if energy traders and energy companies did get their share of public attention and some regulatory response in terms of taxation and disclosure, food traders didn't. In fact, commodity trading is one of the most opaque and complex sectors globally, and food traders, although a small part of it, is one of the murky parts of global business. What I want to show further is this. These are pictures, on the one hand, showing just how profits have changed along with the global commodity cycle for the big 4. So the big 4 here are Archer Daniels Midlands, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, and the blue line is price volatility. And you can see that through relatively stable time between around 2012 to 2020 or 2019, the profitability of the big 4 was more or less on a stable trajectory. And then it escalates massively through the pandemic and in its wake, having been boosted by events in early 2022, but it hasn't stopped there. So food inflation is still up. Historical food prices are still above their pre-pandemic averages, which for developing countries in particular, those who import food translates into, for example, 30% of food price inflation that hurts most vulnerable. And I think the recent estimates that we're putting, in fact, tomorrow in a release of the report update is that by 2030, around 600 million people are expected to be undernourished simply because of lack of availability of food. A little bit of technical note. Profitability is a complex thing, and profits are one of the issues, one of the things that businesses like to manipulate. There are many types of profits. We started looking not at consolidated accounts, but we started looking at all sort of sets of subsidiary reporting for the sector, for the 13 companies that we could get the information for. So again, just to give you an echo, there are 4 big companies that dominate the global food systems. If we stretch further and include other traders who would trade grain or parts of fertilizers, we get 15. So even if you get 15 companies dominating the global food market, it's still only 15 corporations controlling the global food supply. The graph on the right-hand side shows you the dynamic of various components of revenues, incomes, and profits for the sector as a whole. No company is singled out, but it's a dynamic of the sector. You can see one particular line, which is red, going, first of all, very deep down around 2016, 2018, and then it goes above everything else. These are profits before tax. This is profits for everything that these corporations do broadly. Should they do transport services? Should they do digital services? Should they trade in real estate? The income from those activities will go into profits before tax. If you note, these activities have nothing to do with food trading, maybe very remotely, but it's not necessarily directly related to food trading. Because of accounting and financial insight, we take profits before tax as a proxy for financial operations and financial speculation by food traders. And you can see how those profits are above their operating revenues, which is the core profit from their core business. So if they do trade food, that would be qualified as operating revenues. If they speculate in financial derivatives, that revenue would go into profits before tax. The line is before your eyes. And the next graph is one of my favorites in the report. It's a representation of Bank of International Settlements data for commodity derivatives traded over the counter. So these are private deals that are not monitored, that are not regulated on market exchanges. They're opaque and private, OTC derivatives. It's also unfortunate that agriculture commodities are not singled out as a group. They're too small. But you can take a little remark from a graph that is not here, that Europe is the largest global hub for OTC derivatives trading. Other geographies, such as North America or Asia, are large markets for organized financial markets trading derivatives. Europe is a home for global OTC, i.e. opaque, unregulated, non-transparent deals with financial derivatives. And food and other commodities, of course, are being traded as financial asset only. Nobody trades foods for food, right? So the interesting part is the graph is the same. It's just different representation of the same dynamic. The interesting curves are on your left. The orange line suggests or points on how many bets we're taking in the OTC derivative market for part of commodity derivatives. The blue line shows how many of those deals were successful, regardless of where you're betting on price up or price down. It's just a relationship between overall betting and successful betting. You can see that around the commodity peak in 2009, there was a lot of fresh liquidity coming into the market. The line is very high. A lot of bets are successful. These are professional financiers dealing with financial derivatives. It coincides with the time when banks became traders of oil, energy, and other commodities. In the literature, it's called financialization of commodity trading. It's around that time that the Financial Stability Board considered whether commodity traders should in fact be regulated as financial institutions. At the time, it was concluded that there is not enough evidence to extend financial regulations into commodity trading, and they proceeded to be regulated as industrial corporations. Industrial corporations have lots of exceptions in their treatment, in their participation in financial markets, because of course they need to hedge, and they do need to hedge, and speculation is sometimes necessary in the financial markets. But what happened is that coming into our 2021-2022, commodity traders retained and capitalized on their access to financial markets and financial derivatives. They're now the incumbent speculators. They don't have as much professional liquidity going into the market, but they have some. Maybe they're not as astute as speculators or financial innovators. You can see the blue line much more divorced from the orange line, but they are still there. And we find, although it's not a direct line between financial speculation and price increases in food markets, but we find that participation of commodity traders in financial markets amplifies their role in price setting, price intransparency, and of course speculation. Now, this is my favorite picture from the report, and it challenges all the notions about monopoly and corporate power you might have had. The four giant companies, A, B, C, D, are part of the companies presented in the table. But correspondingly, I made sure that we list all the subsidiaries that belong to a firm, for example, called Archer Daniels Midlands. So in the latest count, it has 825 little Archer Daniels Midlands, who are all located in different national jurisdictions, arbitraging between different rules, different transparency requirements, different taxation approaches, and any regulatory context. So as you talk about anti-monopoly regulation, competition, the reach of the state, transparency, you need to keep this in mind, that if you do not understand the significance of subsidiary networks in sustaining corporate power, in yielding more of it, and in allowing corporate arbitrage and maneuvering, a lot of the effort that I already heard today in the morning from the first speaker and you are going to be futile, because it's through the subsidiaries that these giant businesses, although they're giant maybe on the surface, their power lies in the little bits that comprise them. The adaptability, the divisibility, the fragmentation of corporate power through subsidiary holdings and through subsidiary activities, which are all regulated differently and which at the moment are not compulsory to be disclosed, regulated, or monitored, is the source of corporate power and market control. I'm not sure concentration is the word to use, but certainly cross-market and asset control. And then we applied, this is the final result, we applied that theory, or that reality really, to investigating the difference between what these companies report at global ultimate holder level, global ultimate owner level, this is your left-hand side or vertical axis, vis-a-vis what they have in terms of their financial holdings at the subsidiary levels. And we find some discrepancy that applies to firms that are identified as red arrows on the graph. We find that all the big corporations that do control the global food supply and the global food system have, in the years of market volatility, become de facto shadow banks, because they now have more financial investments, more financial holdings, and more financial liquidity at the levels of their subsidiary than the report at the level of their global ultimate owner. So if the Financial Stability Board or any regulator back in 2012 thought that they didn't have enough evidence to maybe extend systemic regulations in finance to these traders, now we have some. Of course, it's one first step, but it's a very crucial beginning of a journey that anybody concerned with financial contagion, financial stability, shadow banking risks can have today. Because, of course, the subprime financial crisis also started off balance sheets with things that nobody really was looking at because they were considered to be risk-free.
Anastasia, could we just
to
maybe
confirm,
wrap it up?
okay, that's the last slide.
Yeah.
To confirm what we were just explaining to you on the basis of our report, Oliver Wyman, the big consultancy on commodity trading in particular, just published their own estimates that the sector is sitting on $120 billion in cash reserves now, ready to bolster their corporate holdings, their corporate power, their corporate control through, they say, investments or reinvestments, but let's take a more critical approach to whether it will be in fact reinvestment or whether it will be a further consolidation of control over complex food systems. This is all. If you want to know more, you can download the report or talk to me, and thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. It was a very interesting presentation. And maybe also to highlight and to link to this last slide, we already see some, for instance, merger and acquisition activity in the sector where I believe that Bunge is being taken over by Viterra. So if we already have few players in the market, they're going to be even fewer. And if they have more and more money, they will have more ability to continue the concentration.
And what if one of them goes down?
Yeah.
And what if one of them goes down under the burden of financial bets or investments that they've been making?
Yeah, it's a risk.
Where they will run to be bailed out?
No, I think that was very clear, but maybe now we can go to Oliver and talk a little bit as well about how concentration affects workers. And I think maybe just as a scene setter as well, we are seeing data and even from the ECB that shows that the wage share, so basically the amount of value that goes to workers, has actually been decreasing just as the profit share has been increasing. So the question is very much like, how do you see that workers are impacted by these higher levels of concentration?
Well, I mean, one of the points is, of course, when we talk about competition, normally it is about companies and consumers and the state trying to somewhat regulate it. And the workers are normally not in the equation. The first point, of course, we have to think about it most consumers, as well as citizens, are actually workers. Yeah? And they derive their possibility to have a decent living by actually having work and earning money. If they don't earn money, they really can't buy products. And of course, when they don't have money, it also makes it much more difficult to be a democratic citizen who takes his rights actively. So Europa is the European Services Workers Union. That means we represent over 50% of the workers, that is those in services. And one of the key points when you look at the services sector as well is those jobs are much more precarious, and they are much more in a situation where they can be affected by uncompetitive behavior. So it's important for us as trade unions, but also as a representative of workers, to make sure that we do something about economic concentration. So simply, economic concentration monopolies are bad for workers, because in the end they have less money in their pockets at the end of the working day. But then when they go to the grocery store, they also have to pay more money for products, and so it's a lose-lose situation for them. So just like consumers, in their role as consumers, they suffer when only one company dominates a particular product market. Workers suffer when they cannot truly choose between employers. On top of it, as I said already, proper competition policies also make sure that companies pay proper taxes and that public services don't suffer. So in the end, it's not only 2 times workers are hit, but 3 times, because as citizens, they also suffer from... Sorry? Yeah, thank you. So they suffer really 3 times. We have seen research by the OECD and also by the UK Competition and Market Authority that the demand for labor in Europe is high, but wages are not rising, so which is very strange, because normally it would be the other way around, and that is an indication that there is no properly functioning labor market. And the reason for this is really the concentration of corporate power. It gives companies substantial power to set wages and conditions, and the antidote for this is, on the one hand, regulation of concentration and monopolies, and building working powers. And as trade unions, our role is, of course, in the first place, to build workers' powers. And how do we do this? We pool workers' power across Europe, and we build collective bargaining. But what you have perhaps heard in some of newspapers' articles, over the last 20 years, collective bargaining in Europe has diminished quite substantially. And there has been a policy by big companies: we don't want to have collective bargaining, especially not at sector level. And what we have seen, however, that there is a change in mood at the moment. In particular, in 2023, the European Union adopted the Minimum Wage Directive, and that basically brought forward a target of 80% collective bargaining coverage. And there we will see that we use this to actually enhance collective bargaining coverage, which then enhances trade union and workers' power, and that should be an antidote towards big companies. So there is a checks and balance system.
You hear me? Yeah. Just a quick follow-up. UNI is also one of the driving forces behind the Make Amazon Pay campaign, which is a union of civil society organizations and trade unions working together on Amazon-related campaigns. You've also supported strikes from Amazon workers in Germany, Spain, Italy, where workers are asking for better pay, better working conditions, and collective bargaining. Amazon is also the second biggest private employer in the world. Do you see a link between the struggles that the Amazon workers are facing and the power that Amazon itself has?
Of course. I mean, Amazon, and I always use a metaphor or the story of Star Trek. Some of you might be interested in Star Trek, and they are the Borgs. And the Borgs basically go around the universe and conquer worlds, and they tell them always, you will be assimilated, resistance is futile. And Amazon is basically the same. They don't do it in one sector, but in many industries, and they basically tell us, you will be Amazonized, resistance is futile. And I think that is really happening. We have a situation there where Amazon is somewhat, broadly they're thinking if human beings could be robots, that would be great. And we are fighting this in many of the sectors, and they are almost everywhere nowadays. However, what I also have to say, we are quite successful to actually resist. It is not futile. We have a big coalition of different groups, political groups, and indeed in the European Parliament. If you want to unite the entire European Parliament again behind one cause, hit Amazon, and they're coming together from the extreme left to the extreme right. So that's very positive, but it's still too many people are buying their products, so it's just, we're all against it, but we're still ordering from Amazon. What we need there is really better rules and better enforcement, which really hits Amazon. And that is really about competition policies. The Commission has good competition policies with the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act. We have really made progress. But what we need to see now is actually enforcement. And there, quite frankly, when we look at regulators, normally they're understaffed and don't have the possibility to really compete with the big lawyers and the big number of lawyers which Amazon can employ. And Amazon is an American company, so they know to evade the law if it's ever possible. But again, we can be successful, and the big success was perhaps last month, when we all rallied together and made sure that Amazon is kicked out of the European Parliament, so the Amazon lobbyists can't go in there. So if civil society, if politicians get together, we actually can manage. And I think as a European, with a positive look at the European social model, I would say we should not live up to being Amazonized, but we should tell Amazon they're Europeanized, and any resistance is futile. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe now to Nick. Of course, we are still in a way recovering from COVID and all the subsequent crises it kind of led to. One of the things that COVID also brought to the forefront was the power of Big Pharma. It probably actually improved its image in Europe largely. So I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to bring you specifically for this, is there a link or is there a negative consequence between Big Pharma's bigger and growing profits, and is there an impact on our lives, our public health systems, on innovation as well?
Thanks. Yeah, I would argue there definitely is. I think that it's extraordinary, really, that we see pharma as this very successful industry, because really it's a perfect example of market failure. The only reason we have new drugs is public funding and public work on an absolutely huge scale, particularly at the most risky bits of medicine development. So this idea that it's the private sector that does the risky entrepreneurial stuff, and then the state comes in and puts its sclerotic hand on something, it just is not borne out at all by the story of medicines. But the crazy thing is we accept that market failure is happening, otherwise we wouldn't put the money in, but then we kind of forget it when we just hand over the research to the private sector and give them literal monopolies for a very long period of time to do what they want with that research. And I would argue there are three negative consequences. The first is cost, which is putting an incredible strain on our public health systems. So we did a little bit of research just in the UK, and we found just 10 medicines, 10 in the last 10 years have cost $13 billion. The vast majority of that is profit, is excess profit, the overwhelming majority. One drug alone, $2 billion, which is a highly rationed drug called Humira. And that is putting a strain not just on the UK. In the Netherlands, there were a bunch of civil society organizations actually trying to sue the maker of Humira for excess profiting at the public expense. I believe something similar is happening here in Belgium too. So that's one. The second is security. We know a lot about how these monopolies through problematic supply chains are increasing insecurity. And we're seeing that across Europe at the moment in terms of shortages of medicines. In France, it's a really acute issue, and the government said they need to take action to do something about it. But the third, and I think the really important one for us to understand, is the impact it has on innovation. Because pharma has told us a lie for many years now, which is, well, you might not like us, You might not like the profits we take. At the end of the day, though, we come up with the goods. We come up with the new medicines, and imagine what your lives will be like without medicines. So they kind of, this is their winning argument, but it's simply untrue. Actually, pharma is an incredibly uninnovative. Well, it depends what you mean by innovation. If you mean making new, radically different drugs that affect the diseases we're suffering from and increase the experience of the patients, they're very, very bad. They are very innovative at finding new ways to create monopolies on drugs that already exist by making tiny changes, right, through evergreening. So 78% of new patents on medicines are simply, basically the same drugs that we've already got. 78% of new patents. A study was done in Germany a few years ago. It found that 57% of new medicines approved had absolutely no additional benefit whatever. Only 10% represented a serious improvement on drugs that were already out there. So, for all of the R&D money that we're putting in as the public, we're not getting the drugs, the new drugs that we need as a society, and we're certainly not getting them at a price we can afford. And I guess the one big example that I think we should all be really frightened about is increasing antimicrobial resistance, which is obviously rendering our antibiotics less and less effective. Our entire medical establishment depends on these things, and pharma is putting almost nothing into this at all. We have one guy who was a conservative member of the government. He's in the House of Lords. He used to be at Goldman Sachs. He's called Jim O'Neill. He worked with pharma for years, trying to incentivize them to put money into antibiotics. 5 years later, he comes back. He's like, I don't believe a word you guys say. You've done nothing. I think you should, most of you should be nationalized. This is from a conservative member of our parliament.
Also, in the sphere of public health, we've seen in the past few years one of the biggest waves of public and civil society mobilization was around the COVID vaccines, and especially to get a waiver from TRIPS agreement so that global south countries would be able to produce the vaccines directly. This gained quite a lot of traction. At some point, even the US came around and supported a waiver. Yet the EU was the big bloc here. So I was wondering if, first of all, how do you see, why did the EU oppose this bloc? And isn't there a sort of doesn't this show a sort of contradiction sometimes between the EU's trade policy and the EU's own ambitions for its internal market?
I think that's exactly right. So the problems I've described are as of nothing compared to the problems the medical research and development in the global south. There are simply not the incentives in the system to create the medicines needed at a price that can be afforded for most countries in the world. And in COVID, you saw that, particularly, of course, we did create the vaccine, thank goodness, but most countries in the global south were not able to purchase that vaccine. And again, it goes back to this common problem of monopolies, and the real issue here was in the middle of the 1990s, we decided in our wisdom that every country in the world effectively should have US-style intellectual property standards. Nobody ever in the past thought that was a good idea. And people would have thought that was crazy, and it's created such a problem from HIV to cystic fibrosis drugs today, where countries are simply not able to learn from what we've done and produce their own, just as in the pandemic, they were not able to learn from what we've done and produce their own. We could have had so many more COVID vaccines coming on to the market much, much more rapidly, but we simply refused to allow hundreds of factories throughout the world in dozens of countries to produce because we judged the intellectual property rights of the corporations who'd not even invented those vaccines was more important than ending a pandemic equitably. And I think that the EU's position on that was really deeply hypocritical, as was my own government, the UK government, the same. It was one thing that Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel seemed to really agree on, was that the profits of the pharmaceutical companies should come ahead of ending this pandemic. And it went against the policies that they themselves were saying might be necessary in Europe. And today in Europe, and I think it's great, the European Parliament and the European Commission are considering how to change this industry and the need potentially for compulsory licensing and how we make industrial strategy work to make this industry better. But we're not thinking about the impacts that our trade policies have on other countries being able to have those same rights. And if it's a problem for our medicine development, only imagine what kind of problem it is going to be as we try and tackle climate change. And I think this is really important because as we're putting in place our own industrial policies for climate change here, many of which I'm very supportive of, although I think they should go much, much further, I'm incredibly worried that you're actually going to see increased global inequality because most countries in the world will be locked out of those industrial strategies precisely by our intellectual property system. And we admit this in UNFCCC COP after UNFCCC COP. We talk about tech transfer and so on, all the very nice language there, almost nothing is done about it.
That's, yeah, really clear answer actually. And maybe now we can turn to Johannes. And I think yeah, we've heard here a lot of things, and they are not necessarily what you often hear in competition policy circles, right? We are bringing in issues that are related to trade. We're talking about corporate structure transparency. We're talking about collective bargaining. We've also seen in the past, and especially with the Bayer-Monsanto merger, we've seen environmental groups and farmers trying to enter into the discussion of competition policy. But issues of sustainability and public health were not actually accepted as arguments within this field. Yeah, so my question to you is a very wide one, and you can take it however you wish. But basically, can actually these wider concerns, these societal concerns, be taken in competition policy framework?
Well, thank you very much, Margareta, for the invitation, also the question. Let me just start by saying that I'm just expressing my personal views only, and that these do not engage any institution I'm affiliated with. And broadly speaking, you know, the program put forward by the manifesto resonates certain things with me. In particular, you know, the emphasis put on tools like the market investigation references. Greece has been one of the first countries in Europe to copy the market investigation reference from the UK. We have this in our law since 2005. And for a long period of time, it hasn't been used. I'm pretty happy that during my mandate, we have been using it 3 times for different types of products and services. And I think this is really a little bit about how we can operationalize the discussion into concepts and methods and tools that could be used by competition authorities. And you're absolutely right. These issues were not really discussed 5 to 10 years ago. We have been a few academics discussing about these broader perspectives, but unfortunately there was a commitment to the consumer welfare paradigm, and these discussions were somehow considered as very fringe. And what is interesting in the last 5 years is that they're becoming now mainstream. And that creates a little bit the issue for competition authorities because they will need to operationalize these discussions and develop concepts, tools, and methodologies that could be somehow put in effect in their day-to-day work. And this is something which is missing. And I guess, you know, this is really a little bit what we have to work on the next few years, also in academia, about how to build these more, this broader, basically, competition law paradigm. Now, in my work, I've been putting forward since 2017-18 this polycentric competition law paradigm, which is basically, I mean, if I can put it simply, is to embed, and I'm using this, you know, concept of embeddedness, is to embed basically competition law in the context of the existing institutions that we have and the systems of normative values that govern the specific European policy that we have. And these are pretty much clear in our material constitution. These are expressed in the treaty. I mean, it's not really doing something, transforming competition law to a law of everything. We just have to apply what is in the treaty. And this is, I think, one of the essence, basically, how to embed competition law to the broader social European contract, as this is expressed in the European treaty. So basically, what we ask competition authorities is to apply the law. And the essence of the polycentric approach has a double claim. So the first one is whatever the content of the material constitutions is, and it could also apply in the context of a neoliberal constitution. Polycentricity, in the sense of polyarchy, should be an intrinsic aim of competition law. We should actually have different centers, so epolarchy. I think that's an important claim. It's part of the ontology of competition law. That's what competition law is for. So the second claim is that we should not only, rely on the consumer welfare standard, and we should not only rely on price-based revealed preferences, but we also have to see, and I follow up a little bit what Oliver was saying before, individuals as interacting in different spheres of social activity. I mean, the economic approach of competition law, which is the consumer welfare approach, has been separating the economic sphere from all the other spheres. Not necessarily understanding that power can be converted, from one sphere to the other, from the economic sphere to political sphere to cultural sphere, and not also understanding that preferences also are not just expressed in the context of the market, but because people are not just consumers, voting in terms of buying products according to the money they have. They are also citizens, they're also workers, and they express their social preferences as well in these other spheres of human activity. And I think the problem that we had so far is that have been focusing only on information that comes out from the market sphere, not necessarily taking the perspective, the more social contract perspective, which is to see what are the views, what are the preferences of these citizens expressed, let's say, in the Constitution. And if we look to the European Constitution, and we have Article 3, Paragraph 3 of the TEU, which basically very clearly provides that the Union shall establish an internal market with a goal of achieving a highly competitive social market economy aiming at full employment and social progress. We have in the treaty a number of provisions, the so-called horizontal clauses, that impose an obligation to the European Commission all other European institutions take into account environmental concerns, sustainability, the protection of the employment. So the whole point is how we can change the way we think about competition law to integrate a little bit this broader social contract dynamic, and how actually we can possibly, put forward different methodologies and concepts that could be used in this more policy-centric competition law. Now, what actually, and there has been some progress there. Martin is here, so you have been, quite interesting discussions at the ECN that moved forward and integrated sustainability concerns, not just environmental sustainability concerns, but also social sustainability concerns in our discussions. We have actually the collective bargaining recommendation that, resulted from a lot of work from academics, myself included actually, in order to push forward for labor markets to be part of the discussion in competition law. Secondly, we have environmental sustainability agreements that are now in the cooperation, horizontal cooperation agreement, where we don't just think about individual use benefits, but also about collective benefits for environment. I mean, this is quite important, right? And this is something that eventually could be, used to expand the consideration of collective benefits. I think the next important thing is to focus on structural inequality, right? I think the concept of structural inequality is basically, providing emphasis on vulnerability. Some people, because of their lack of mobility, they cannot switch in terms of, products. They cannot because they are technologically or economically dependent. So this is something that needs to be part of the discussion, how we can actually develop concepts that could focus on structural inequalities. And also, and that's my last point, we'll continue discussing about that, I think we need to envision the role of competition authorities as engineers. How we can engineer the structural conditions that will make markets work for the benefit of the people, eventually also integrated into our competition analysis, broader public interest concerns that go beyond the usual focus on price and output. But again, very important, these concerns are not the concerns that some unelected competition authority officials have taken into account. No, they are in the Constitution. So we just apply basically what is in the European Constitution, and that's basically the message.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes. If we have one question from the audience, if anyone has a very pressing question, we can take it. If not, we can move on to the next panel probably. But thank you very much to all the panelists. I think this is really interesting, and I think it is potentially a little bit challenging to the current, well, certainly someone who attends a fair few of these conferences, this is a little bit of a different discussion that normally happens there. But Johannes, I think, is also bringing in a good perspective that actually there has been change already. We just need to take it a bit further. So thank you.